Week we're exploring pastoral responses to grief and loss, particularly public pastoral responses. So we'll look at funerals, the role of funerals, visitation, and all of that, because that's a significant part of our role as faith leaders, as communities of faith in times of grief and loss. We'll also touch a little bit on some of the personal responses, which we've seen throughout the course, to get a little bit more practical. So this week is kind of when we've done a lot conceptually and theoretically. Now we're really looking at how do we ground these understandings in the real life situations of grief and loss and providing care. So that's kind of where we're going this week. So you see at the beginning there, I thought I would just invite you to reflect on your own experiences. Of course, since we're doing this online, this is more rhetorical. So you can just kind of take time to think through these 5 questions. Take as much time as you need. What is your sense, the purpose of the funeral, and so on as you go through. And then hopefully, if you want to, you can revisit these questions after this week and see if your thinking has deepened, has changed, adjusted, and if so, in what ways. And if you didn't read, here's Fowler's text. I happen to have it with me right here. It's a really good one. It's very user-friendly, very practical. So if you didn't get a chance to get to it this week, I would recommend putting it on your list of reading in the near future, particularly if you find yourself in the role of senior pastor or solo pastor, primary pastor, one who's going to be overseeing the funeral ministry of your particular community of faith. I think you'll find it really helpful. So as we continue on this week, a few reflections on helping again before we get into more of the public expressions. So a couple of quotes that I thought were helpful is, again, drawing from Mitchell and Anderson and looking at the primary aspect of the pastoral care is really keeping the communication open between the grieving person or persons, if it's a family, and God. And so we are there as a facilitator, maybe a conduit of communication, conduit of grace, offering a ministry of presence, those sorts of things. But if we keep that in our mind, that we are really trying to facilitate communication, and we're not trying to filter that communication, which is another task, but we're really just trying to keep the lines of communication open, and that includes lament, anger, questions, doubt, hope, and so on, all the things we've talked about thus far. And so what can happen is we can subtly sneak into finding ourselves maybe being the go-between or the mediator between the person or the family and God. And that can make us feel pretty important and self-righteous and so on. And so Mitchell and Anderson are just reminding us that if we find ourselves sliding into that position or that posture in our caregiving, that can be particularly abusive, taking advantage of a vulnerable person, a vulnerable situation, etc. So that's more just for your own self-awareness, self-check, ongoing self-reflective processing. The next slide talks about presence and absence in helping. And so we've talked about the importance of being present and listening and being empathetic and creating space and creating space for silence and all of those things. And we also looked at one of the things that we are doing is we're bearing witness. We're sort of giving audience to the pain and the lament. And the quote there really describes that the loss isn't really concrete or understood until it's verbalized and someone is willing to listen and hear it. And so that's the powerful ministry that we offer. But there are also times where we need to give space, allow the person to have their own space and grieve. And remember, Mitchell and Anderson talked about in the initial phases of the grieving process, having a self-focus is actually important and okay. So if someone retreats back into their own life and space and maybe doesn't want to be as engaged socially for a time, that's actually a helpful thing. And I would say that's also good for us as caregivers. And what Fowler talks about, he talks about the difference between ordinary time and funeral time, is that in funeral time, things are sped up and happening quickly, a series of days where you're busy, you're having a bunch of conversations and meeting with the family and planning and so on and so forth. He really encourages shorter interactions and then leaves of absence and then another action, and rather than a prolonged series. One of the examples he gives is when it was in the evening, about 9 p.m., he got a phone call that a congregation member's family member had passed away. So he said he got to the house about 10 p.m. that night, and there was already family and friends and everybody kind of around the house. And so he, made his introductions, gave condolences to the family members, met some people, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the book, he writes about he had a choice to either take a seat and sit down for what would be a prolonged period of time and maybe interact with a few other strangers and so on, or to maybe take his leave and then focus on the next phases of the funeral preparation and so on and so forth. So he chose the latter and offered to say a prayer. And so everybody gathered into one room, and he said a prayer and sort of was a public expression in time of grieving, and the family was really appreciative. And then shortly after that, he left and then went on with some other things. But then he also went back, over and over to connect with them, plan the service, do the service, etc. So that's sort of what we're getting at with presence and absence. On the next slide, we see there's different modes of helping, and we'll kind of go through these quickly on the next series of slides. And some of this, again, are things that we've discussed already in the course, so we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on them. But I wanted to put them all in one spot, again, as we're looking at personal care and then how that extends into public expressions of pastoral care. So, of course, we have the intervention and relief. We can offer support, we can offer encouragement, and we facilitate meaning-making process. So interventions are sometimes where we take more of a directive role. This might be particularly in the initial stages of grief where someone is still more in shock and maybe not thinking through, and so we start to help them think through the very day-to-day sort of logistical things about planning a service and what elements of the service and who's going to be a part of it, and we can help them coordinate meals, and we can help coordinate rides and things like that. We can advocate with the funeral home. Often, unfortunately, this is a time where funeral homes like to take advantage of people and try to upsell them on the caskets and experiences and other things. And of course, when our family member has died, we want to do the best that we can to their memory and so on and so forth. So there might be times where we can advocate and interject and help them make better decisions and so on. So supporting, of course, is just coming alongside someone. In psychological terms, we often call this creating a holding environment. Winnicott was the one who sort of coined this term, but basically we create that safe space where they can be authentic, be vulnerable, be themselves, sit with pain and anger and questions and so on. And our job is to be willing to stay in that space and create that space, even though it's often uncomfortable. The encouragement is there's moments where now we can help the grieving person remember in a certain way. Maybe we help them talk through taking up a cause. Often people find that really powerful. So if their loved one has died of cancer, maybe they start a local chapter of awareness. Or if someone has died in a car accident or something, maybe they take up a cause for better laws and safety and so on and so forth. So there's times we can do that. There's also times where we can encourage them to kind of, or maybe, encourage them along in the meaning-making process, encourage them along in thinking of how they envision themselves into the future. And encouragement is not necessarily like a cheerleader rah-rah encouragement, but it can be more the types of questions that we ask, the way that we frame things, the way that we are present with them, that sort of thing. And then lastly, of course, is helping the reintegration meaning-making process, which we spent a lot of time on last week. So I'll just leave the slide there. You can kind of read through that and refresh your memory on that process. Then on the next two slides, this comes from Jim Cock, who a longtime pastor, I think he's retired now, and wrote a little handbook on life and death and some other pastoral care books. But he kind of breaks down pastoral caregiving in these steps, 12 different steps that you can kind of read through. Again, very practical, very straightforward, about things that we've talked about throughout the course, other things that are important. So again, you can kind of take your time reading through them, envisioning yourself, if you are the one guiding a person or family through the grieving process, how you might do these things. Of course, this is not just steps 1 through 12 in order, but these are dimensions or aspects of our pastoral care with others. So that's more on a personal level. Now, for the rest of this week, for this part, and then we'll also do a part 2, as I've done in past weeks, we're going to look at the public pastoral responses. So we've met with family, we've planned things, we've done some things, etc. And now we come to spaces where we are maybe the faith leader in the community of faith, or the community at large, and there are some responses that we can offer. And so Larry Graham, in his, it's a little bit dated now, but in his article about the Columbine shooting, because he was near to that in Colorado, teaching at Iliff Theological Seminary, reflecting on the role of pastoral caregivers in that public space. And he broke it down nicely into 3 different aspects. So the first, of course, is we can lament, and we can create space for public lament, for public crying out, for public acknowledgement of the loss, naming the reality of the loss, naming the pain. And as we do that, there can be rituals and ceremonies and memorials and things like that we can help facilitate as a faith leader. Another dimension of public response is that we can ask the theodicy questions. So we sort of explore the suffering questions and help the community process through that in different ways. Sometimes that's in our own response, in our own encouragement of expressions, in our own unwillingness to offer the cliches, and our unwillingness to maybe simplify the theological understandings in those public spaces is a way that we can interrogate the beliefs and encourage others to do that work that we talked about, of moving embedded theological understandings to deliberative theological understandings. And then the third dimension is where in all of that process, particularly for Christians, there's this moment where we still remember God and God's faithfulness and God's presence with us and God's covenant with us. And so in the midst of the crying out and the questioning and the anger and the frustration, there's moments of hope and moments of remembrance. And we begin to reconstruct our life and identity in ways that are hopeful, and we begin to ask not the question of why do we suffer, but where is God in our midst, knowing that God is suffering with us? What is God calling us to do as a community to respond? And so we see practices of solidarity, generosity, inclusivity, justice, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of in a bigger picture, broadly speaking, and then we'll get to the funeral more specifically in a minute here. But before that, I just wanted to stop and look at ritual, because we could think of funerals and the processes that lead up to funerals, the different elements and the pieces of that are part of our rituals. Particularly I'm thinking particularly in the West and in the United States, sort of Protestant Christian, overall Christian, pretty standard rituals in the grieving and funeral process. And you see simply that rituals are religious ceremony, have a series of actions performed according to a prescribed order. And one of the powerful things about rituals, not only are they performative and they're constructive, but they're kind of performed according to this prescribed order. So there's familiarity and there's comfort and there's kind of the rhythm of what I've grown up with and known and value, and that can bring a sense of comfort in the midst of the chaos around the loss and the grief and feeling helpless and somewhat hopeless and so on. The ritual can kind of bring back a sense of stability. Remember, we talked about attachment theory and having the secure home base and so on. So ritual can kind of bring one back to that space. And so that's why it's powerful. So as we transition then into part 2 of this week's lecture, we'll look at the funeral and kind of break that down more precisely.